Imagine for a moment that you're barely 13 years old. You're draped in silk and gold, surrounded by the most powerful men of the Ottoman Empire. Around you, music plays, lamps illuminate the halls, and everyone celebrates your wedding with smiles. But deep down, you're trembling. You're not trembling because you don't know your husband well. You've barely seen him once. Nor because you must leave your family forever, whom you'll rarely see again. You're trembling because you know that in a few hours, when the doors close and the crowd disperses, you'll be left alone with a man 3 times your age in a room where your entire destiny will be decided between silk sheets. Being an Ottoman princess didn't mean living a fairy tale. It meant facing a wedding night that wasn't an intimate or romantic act, but a cruel examination. That first night wasn't just about losing your virginity. It meant proving your worth as political currency, preserving your family's honor, and submitting to a system that used your body as a tool of imperial power. What was expected of you wasn't love, but perfect obedience, blood as proof, and the promise of heirs. The most disturbing thing is that these girls, turned into brides too soon, perfectly understood what was at stake. Every glance from the courtiers, every jewel given as part of the dowry, every whispered word during the ceremonies was a reminder that their lives didn't belong to them. They weren't beloved daughters, but living treaties. They weren't innocent young women, but strategic pieces on the empire's chessboard. The Ottoman Empire, at the height of its power, controlled 3 continents and dominated the spice routes. But it also managed one of history's most sophisticated marital industries. In that universe, princesses were the center of alliances, promises of peace or war, instruments of loyalty and subjugation. And the most unsettling thing, they knew it from childhood. Every poetry lesson, every musical chord learned, every refined gesture at the table wasn't for personal pleasure, but training to seduce diplomats, to please husbands, to reinforce treaties. Today we're going to unveil a truth that shatters the golden image of royal tales. Behind the shining walls of palaces and harems, a mechanism was hidden that transformed fear into obedience, innocence into strategy, and weddings into business. We're going to discover why the most privileged princesses of one of the world's most powerful empires dreaded the arrival of their first wedding night, and how that experience marked not only their lives, but also the destiny of an entire empire. To understand the true weight that rested on the shoulders of an Ottoman princess, we must abandon the idea that they were merely privileged daughters surrounded by luxury. In reality, they were political weapons with a human face, pieces on an imperial chessboard where every move could mean the survival or collapse of entire alliances. From the very moment they were born, they weren't seen as girls, but as future treaties, as promises of union with powerful generals, provincial governors, or influential families whose loyalty could define the stability of the throne. When a sultan had a daughter, he didn't just celebrate the arrival of a new family member. What was truly born was a bargaining chip, a diplomatic tie that could be played at the exact moment to guarantee peace or quell rebellions. This pragmatic view turned princesses into resources as valuable as armies or treasures. They were literally political flesh. The preparation of these girls for the destiny that awaited them was meticulous and, to modernize, cruelly calculated. Their education didn't aim for the development of personal talents, but rather the refinement of skills useful for court and diplomacy. They learned foreign languages because a polyglot princess impressed ambassadors and facilitated international alliances. They were taught poetry and philosophy not to nourish their spirit, but because a cultured wife could make an ally feel flattered and, therefore, more loyal. Even the music they practiced and the dances they memorized weren't for their enjoyment, but to keep husbands entertained who represented vital political interests. But the most unsettling aspect of the Ottoman system was the paradox it imposed on these princesses. Unlike young noblewomen in Europe, who automatically became subservient to their husbands upon marriage, Ottoman princesses retained a superior status. As direct daughters of the Sultan, they held a higher rank than their husbands, even if these were powerful commanders or governors. They could control their own household, manage resources, and, in theory, even deny physical intimacy indefinitely. At first glance, this might seem like an extraordinary privilege, a form of emancipation ahead of its time. But in reality, it was a double-edged sword. That power, far from liberating them, burdened them with unbearable pressure. The question wasn't whether they would be obedient, but how they would use that authority to maintain the delicate balance between their own rank and their husband's ego. A miscalculation could turn an ally into a mortal enemy. Every gesture, every word, every decision was scrutinized, not just within the household, but throughout the entire palace. In their first nights of marriage, the difference from European princesses was brutal. While in the West the expectation was simple, to consummate the union and produce heirs, in the Ottoman Empire, the young wife had to demonstrate political shrewdness, negotiation skills, and emotional control. She had to know how far to yield and when to assert herself. She had to feign submission without losing authority. She had to please without ceasing to command. It was such a delicate dance of power that even adult women would have struggled to maintain it. But here were girls, barely teenagers, who were required to have the maturity of strategists. This game of appearances reached its peak in imperial weddings. These ceremonies weren't mere family celebrations, but true displays of wealth and political supremacy that could last for weeks. Every detail had a purpose, from the parades showcasing the princess's dowry to the banquets proclaiming the sultan's grandeur. For the girl becoming a wife, every room filled with hand-woven carpets, every display jewel, every gown embroidered for months by dozens of artisans, was a reminder that her personal worth was measured by what she represented for the empire. And yet the most valuable piece of that entire dowry wasn't gold or silk, it was her virginity. That fragile and deeply intimate condition became the greatest treasure, the foundation upon which the entire political alliance rested. Upon it depended not only her honor, but also the stability of her family and the credibility of the Ottoman court. Thus, these princesses grew up with the awareness that their body was a political battlefield and that their destiny would be decided on that first night they so feared. If Ottoman princesses were seen as political weapons, their virginity was considered the gunpowder that made them useful. No symbol in the entire empire was more powerful or more fragile. From the moment an engagement was announced, wedding preparations revolved obsessively around that aspect, making it the absolute linchpin of the young woman's destiny. Marriage ceremonies were dazzling spectacles designed to impress both local guests and foreign emissaries. They weren't just celebrations, they were demonstrations of imperial supremacy. For days and even weeks, the princess's dowry was displayed as if it were a catalog of infinite riches. Carpets patiently woven, worth more than a peasant would see in their entire life. Chests overflowing with precious stones capable of funding military campaigns. Gowns embroidered with gold thread, crafted by artisans who spent months on a single piece. Each object was a reminder that the princess represented not just a family, but an entire empire. But amidst all that ostentation, there was a brutal silence. The most important asset wasn't in the treasure-filled halls, but in the girl's body. Virginity was presented as the most precious treasure, the one that defined the economic and political value of the alliance. It was assumed that an intact princess guaranteed purity, honor, and above all, legitimacy. The larger the dowry payment, the greater the certainty had to be that this virginity was intact. The consequence of this logic was devastating. Girls grew up aware that their entire lives, their entire education, the full weight of the empire, was concentrated on that first intimate experience. They knew that, when the time came, they would be judged not by their knowledge, not by their intelligence, but by a biological detail that transformed into a political document. The most chilling part is that many of these unions were established when the princesses were mere children. Girls of 5, 6, or 7 years old could be married to men 3 or 4 times their age. Consummation, in theory, was postponed until the wife reached puberty, but that wait became a psychological sentence. The girl knew exactly what awaited her, knew her body would be examined, knew the entire court awaited that moment as if it were a pending financial transaction. The case of Fatma Sultan, daughter of Ahmed III, starkly illustrates this reality. At just 5 years old, she was betrothed to a 42-year-old military commander. Dressed in clothes she didn't understand, she participated in a ceremony that sealed a contract she couldn't imagine. For 7 years, consummation was delayed, not out of compassion, but because she was too young to survive a pregnancy. But that wait, didn't mean freedom. It was a state of constant anticipation, a childhood lived under the shadow of the inevitable. Fatma grew up watching other palace girls transform into women, knowing that one day it would be her turn, with fear lodged in every corner of her childish mind. And when her first husband died in battle, far from being freed, she was immediately given to another older man, close in age to her own father. This time at 13, there were no more excuses. She had to consummate immediately. Thus the young woman understood that her life didn't belong to her, that her body was a living contract, and that virginity, that most intimate condition, was treated as merchandise in the political market. The most disturbing thing was that all of them knew this from a very young age. There was no innocence because fear and expectation corroded every day of their childhood. They grew up understanding that their value wasn't in who they were, but in what they hadn't yet done. Virginity transformed into a burden they couldn't share with their mothers or their sisters, because all were trapped in the same chain of silences. In this scenario, weddings weren't celebrations of love or hope. They were carefully calculated transactions in which a girl became a bargaining chip, and her first night, the decisive moment that defined not only her destiny, but the stability of an entire empire. An Ottoman princess's wedding didn't end with banquets or treasure parades. The true culmination arrived at night, when the hall doors closed and the crowd dispersed. That's when the most dreaded part began, the consummation. In the eyes of the court and the empire, that night wasn't a private act between two people, but a public ceremony wrapped in the illusion of intimacy. The rooms designated for this purpose weren't just simple bedrooms. Special chambers were prepared within the harem, blessed by religious authorities and adorned with symbols of fertility. The tapestries and cushions weren't mere luxuries. They were reminders of the dynastic weight resting on the couple. Every lit candle, every perfume spilled on the sheets, spoke of the duty to prolong the imperial line. For the young girl crossing the threshold, these decorations were invisible bars of a prison where her future was at stake. There was no true intimacy. Outside the chamber, guards and servants remained attentive, waiting to hear sounds that would confirm the union had been consummated. The silence was unbearable. The princess knew that even though no one was physically inside, an entire army waited outside, judging her ability to fulfill her duty. Failure was not an option. It wasn't just about personal dishonor. An unconsummated marriage could be interpreted as a political offense, a mistake that threatened to break alliances, provoke distrust, and unleash reprisals. The paradox for Ottoman princesses was that, in theory, they possessed a unique power. They could refuse. They could delay consummation, negotiate, even physically reject their husband. But this ability was a double-edged sword. Each refusal was a political declaration that could wound the husband's pride, call the sultan's authority into question, or create fissures in the web of alliances. Thus, what seemed like an advantage became another unbearable burden. Dawn brought no rest, but a new torment. The morning after the first night became a ritual as humiliating as it was cruel. Physical proof that the union had taken place had to be presented. Blood-stained sheets were displayed before palace officials, religious authorities, and even foreign diplomats who monitored the validity of the alliance. What should have been intimate and secret transformed into a bureaucratic spectacle. The princess's body, reduced to evidence, was documented as if it were part of a legal contract. If the stains didn't appear, the true horror began. The absence of blood was interpreted as a sign that the princess was not a virgin. This amounted to political treason. Medical reasons or natural variations of the female body didn't matter. A hymen that didn't bleed could destroy alliances that had taken years to negotiate. The young woman was accused of deception, of dishonoring her family, of endangering the empire. The consequences could be devastating, from public repudiation to the forced disappearance of the girl, erased from official records to avoid scandal. The fear of this outcome created a sinister repertoire of strategies. Harem advisors, women who had already endured the same hell, taught young girls techniques to produce convincing evidence. Some received substances that increased bleeding. Others were instructed on how to hide small bags of animal blood under their clothes. The most desperate even concealed sharp objects to inflict cuts during the act, mutilating themselves to avoid failing in their political duty. Imagining adolescents practicing these techniques, guided by hands that were once also terrified girls, shows the extent to which the system had turned intimacy into a macabre theater. Marriage, then, was not a promise of companionship, but a trial by fire where the value of an entire life depended on a piece of stained fabric. And the worst part was that everyone knew it. The princess, the husband, the servants, the diplomats. No one was unaware that that night was a public examination disguised as a private ritual. Physical pain mingled with emotional humiliation, and the bridal bed became the stage for a tragedy that transcended the personal to become a matter of state. Thus, marital consummation in the Ottoman Empire was never an act of love, but a political trial. A trial in which princesses were condemned beforehand, trapped between the fear of failure and the certainty that their bodies did not belong to them. In those perfumed rooms under candlelight, no fairy tales were written. Blood pacts were signed that would decide the fate of entire empires. Religion, which theoretically should have offered protection and comfort, transformed into another tool of control over the Ottoman princesses. Islamic law recognized a woman's right to give or withhold her consent, but within the empire's political framework, these guarantees were twisted until they became an additional burden. A princess could refuse to consummate her marriage by citing religious reasons, but doing so implied something more dangerous: publicly declaring her husband unworthy, risking insult to influential families or sparking diplomatic tensions. The palace had created a complex system of excuses to balance religion and politics. Princesses could indefinitely delay intimacy if they offered acceptable reasons: extreme devotion, physical fragility, emotional distress. But each argument had to be calibrated with surgical precision. An excess of fervor could be interpreted as criticism of the arranged marriage. A supposed physical weakness could raise suspicions about infertility. A mention of sadness could be considered a sign of mental instability. Thus, every word spoken to protect themselves could be turned against them, trapping them in a no-win labyrinth. Added to this burden was the relentless surveillance of the harem. After the wedding, the princess acquired her own space within the court, a home where, in theory, even her husband needed permission to enter. This sounded like a privilege, but in reality it was another stage for control. Inside those rooms, every gesture and every conversation was observed by maids who reported directly to palace officials. They weren't mere assistants, but informants who recorded the progress of the marriage, the couple's compatibility, and above all, any signs of pregnancy. The princess's body became a public matter. Her menstruation was carefully observed, her mood swings noted, her appetite measured as a sign of possible hormonal variations. Intimacy was reduced to a medical-political file shared with officials and advisors. Privacy, even for the most powerful women in the empire, became a non-existent luxury. The pressure to conceive a male heir was immense. A princess who didn't become pregnant quickly began to be seen as a problem. The legitimacy of her marriage was questioned, and with it, the alliance it represented. Month after month, her menstruation was not a natural process, but a public sentence of failure. Each cycle meant disappointment, each delay sparked rumors, each physical symptom became a cause for speculation. Palace doctors with limited knowledge and rudimentary beliefs were constantly called upon to intervene. They recommended restrictive diets, herbal concoctions, and painful procedures that often weakened more than they helped. In extreme cases, they performed primitive surgeries that left physical and emotional scars impossible to erase. And when miscarriages or failed births occurred, the blame always fell on the princess. Physical pain was multiplied by public shame, as if losing a child were proof of incompetence or lack of faith. Daily life in the harem thus transformed into a theater of permanent surveillance. The princesses knew they couldn't express frustration with their husbands, couldn't complain about the treatment they received, or show doubts about their destiny, because any word could be reported and used against them. Their maids, seemingly loyal, were also spies who measured these women's obedience and disposition. They lived surrounded by luxuries, yes, but within an invisible prison where the empire's gaze never left them. And amidst this web of pressure, the only thing that could guarantee them some stability was the very thing that destroyed them: pregnancy. Conceiving a male heir meant securing their position, consolidating the alliance, and silencing suspicions. But it also meant risking their lives in a dangerous childbirth, at a time when maternal mortality was extremely high. Thus, what should have been a moment of hope became another condemnation, bringing an heir into the world at any cost, even that of their own existence. In the Ottoman Empire, religion, surveillance, and fertility formed a suffocating triangle that trapped princesses in a routine of constant fear. Every prayer could be interpreted as defiance, every gesture observed as betrayal, every menstruation as failure. What seemed like a resplendent palace was, in reality, a stage for psychological torture, where faith, body, and intimacy were reduced to instruments of power. In such a ruthless system, the only way to survive was to learn to play by the same rules that oppressed them. Some Ottoman princesses developed skills we would today call psychological manipulation, but which in their time were simple survival strategies. They learned to smile when they wanted to cry, to appear grateful when they were actually humiliated, to project obedience while silently plotting to maintain a minimum of control. The cruelest paradox was that these girls, barely teenagers, had to become masters of deception. They knew that sincerity could destroy them. Expressing pain, fear, or rebellion was equivalent to signing their sentence of isolation or death. That's why they cultivated an extraordinary talent: pretense, faking pleasure during the wedding night to avoid accusations of frigidity, faking religious devotion to avoid suspicions of rebellion, faking submission to buy time. Every gesture was a calculation, every word a strategy. But the price of this skill was extremely high. Princesses who managed to manipulate the system rarely got to experience authentic relationships. True love, sincere friendship, or complete trust became impossible luxuries. Suspicion permeated everything. Was that servant loyal or a spy? Was that tender gesture from her husband real or part of a political performance? These women's hearts remained trapped in a cage of perpetual distrust. Trauma was inevitable. Today we would call it complex stress disorder. Back then it was labeled as ingratitude, rebellion, or coldness. Those who became quiet after a traumatic wedding were branded as insubordinate. Those who feared intimacy were categorized as defective wives. Instead of compassion, they received punishment and contempt. Internal pain was interpreted as a moral failing. The cycle of violence was perpetuated in a perverse way. Older princesses, who had survived their own night of terror, became instructors for the younger ones. They taught them to pretend, to bleed, to negotiate with fear. They did so convinced they were protecting them, but in reality they transmitted the same trauma they had suffered. Thus the harem transformed into a school of pain, where victims became unconscious executioners, reinforcing the chains of tradition. Some tried to resist. There were princesses who refused to marry, who tried to delay ceremonies, who even tried to flee. But the punishment was immediate and brutal. Disobedience could be paid with exile, with even more humiliating marriages, or with a silent death in the palace corners. Those who managed to escape were pursued and brought back to be displayed as an example of what happened to those who defied the system. Public humiliation served as a warning to all the others. And yet, even those who seemed to find some happiness were not safe either. A princess who achieved a stable relationship with her husband lived under the constant shadow of political instability. A change of alliance, an unexpected conflict, a betrayal in court was enough for that marriage to fall apart in a matter of days. A husband who was too independent could be eliminated. A bond that was too strong could become a threat. Love, when it appeared, was a fragile luxury that could be revoked at any moment. The documentation that has reached us today reveals a system of psychological abuse so systematic that it would now be classified as torture. And the most disturbing thing is that these were not isolated excesses, but regular, accepted, institutionalized procedures. The empire had designed a perfect mechanism to extract maximum political benefit from these women while maintaining the facade of privilege and luxury intact. The princesses, who in the eyes of the world seemed to live surrounded by splendor, were actually prisoners of a mechanism that consumed their humanity. They learned to survive, yes, but at the cost of mutilating their own essence. They were powerful women in appearance, but deep down they were broken, wounded inside, forced to play a constant role so as not to be devoured by the system. The most painful image is that of these young women looking at each other, knowing they shared the same fate, but unable to break the cycle. They knew they were victims, but also guardians of the same torment they had inherited. And in that contradiction, they lived trapped in a macabre theater where suffering was confused with duty and obedience was disguised as honor. The image the Ottoman Empire projected to the outside world was one of majestic power, sustained by incalculable riches and lavish ceremonies. In the eyes of foreign ambassadors and chroniclers, the princesses lived in a paradise of marble and silk, surrounded by perfumes, music, and luxury. But behind that resplendent facade lay a reality that, viewed from today, can be described as a system of institutionalized psychological torture. The so-called golden cages were exactly that, prisons covered in gold. The young women who lived there were praised for their position, but deep down they were prisoners of a machinery designed to control them until their last breath. Luxury functioned as a disguise, a mask that concealed the pain, and at the same time as an instrument of manipulation. The splendor constantly reminded them that they were privileged, that they should feel grateful, even though every gesture of apparent generosity hid new chains. The most perverse aspect was the way they were made to believe that their suffering was actually an honor. They were repeatedly told that enduring fear, surveillance, and the sacrifice of their privacy amounted to serving the empire, protecting their family, ensuring peace. Abuse was disguised as sacred duty, exploitation as privilege. Today we would call it gaslighting, convincing the victim that their pain isn't real, or that, if it is, they should interpret it as a privilege few possess. The consequences of this system did not end with the borders of the Ottoman Empire. The idea that a woman's worth was measured by her sexual purity, that her virginity was a political document, spread far beyond Istanbul. It influenced marital customs in different cultures, permeated legal systems, and perpetuated attitudes toward female sexuality that survived for centuries. Even in modern societies, echoes of that legacy resonate. The obsession with honor, the control of female bodies, the distrust of women's autonomy. Upon examining accounts of the past, the most painful contradiction becomes apparent. The women who seemed most free were, in reality, the most controlled. The princesses who lived surrounded by servants, jewels, and political power were also the most heavily monitored, those who had the least say over themselves. Freedom was a carefully constructed illusion to conceal the invisible prison. Ottoman court documents show that these abuses were not accidents or whims of certain men, but standardized practices. There was no room for chance. Everything was regulated, from the moment of consummation to the way evidence was presented, from the reports of the servants to the evaluations of the doctors. It was an institutional mechanism that turned each princess into a token, a file, an object of transaction. Upon understanding this hidden truth, the splendor of the palaces fades. The marble walls no longer seem like symbols of grandeur, but of confinement. Embroidered sheets cease to be ornaments and become blood-stained judicial evidence. Banquets that once evoked abundance transform into theaters of manipulation. The supposed privilege is revealed as a mask that hid an unbearable price. The legacy of these women is not in the jewels they wore, nor in the palaces they inhabited, but in the memory of their silent resistance. To remember them is to recognize that what history called honor was, in reality, oppression, that what the court described as prestige was pain, that what the empire celebrated as alliances was the systematic exploitation of girls turned into political instruments. Thus, by stripping bare the truth behind that imperial privilege, we understand that the Ottoman princesses were prisoners of a sophisticated system, a system that made suffering a duty and obedience a form of torture. Their lives compel us to question not only history, but also the narratives that even today disguise oppression as privilege and pain as luxury. The history of Ottoman princesses forces us to look beyond the splendor of palaces and the romantic legends that for centuries enveloped the lives of royal families. Behind the marble walls, behind the embroidered gowns and glittering jewels, lay a relentless system that turned intimacy into a contract, the body into a political battlefield, and pain into a carefully orchestrated routine. These young women, presented as symbols of privilege, were in reality the empire's most closely guarded prisoners. Every one of their decisions, every word, every silence was laden with consequences that could alter the fate of entire provinces. They were expected to be obedient, cunning, fertile, submissive, and yet powerful, to accept surveillance, fear, and humiliation as a natural part of their duty. And most heartbreakingly, to believe that all of it was an honor. The contrast between appearance and reality is what makes their story so chilling. Because from the outside, everything seemed like a fairy tale. Chroniclers spoke of endless banquets, unimaginable dowries, of princesses surrounded by luxuries the common people could only dream of. But from within, those same princesses trembled in the solitude of their chambers, knowing their lives could collapse in an instant if they failed the test of their first night, if they didn't conceive a male heir, if they couldn't balance the fragile dance of power imposed upon them. As we remember their silenced voices, we understand that oppression doesn't always appear as iron chains or dark prisons. Sometimes it disguises itself as privilege, honors, luxuries that hide an impossible price to pay. Ottoman princesses lived in gilded cages, convinced their suffering was a duty, trapped in a mechanism that used them to uphold the grandeur of an empire. What's most important to salvage today isn't just the harshness of their experience, but what it teaches us about power and its mechanisms. The control of female bodies, the obsession with sexual purity, the reduction of women to political instruments are not practices buried in ancient history. These are ideas that, transformed and disguised, continue to resonate in many current societies. The lesson they leave us is clear. Every time a woman's worth is measured by her virginity, every time she is judged by her obedience or her ability to please, we are repeating echoes of that same system. That's why, as we conclude this journey through the lives of the Ottoman princesses, we must view their stories not as distant tales but as warnings. Warnings of what happens when power masquerades as love, when obedience is imposed as a virtue, when pain is cloaked in honor. They were neither heroines nor victims in a simple sense. They were human beings who did their best to survive in impossible circumstances, who learned to negotiate with fear, to manipulate when necessary, to resist in silence. Today, by remembering them, we restore something that was taken from them, their humanity, because beyond being princesses, they were girls, teenagers, and women with dreams, fears, and desires. And although official history may have reduced them to political contracts, their experiences remind us that true greatness lies not in gold or power, but in the ability to recognize and resist injustice. So the next time we hear talk of princess stories, royal romances, or lives of luxury, let's remember what was hidden behind those walls of the Ottoman Empire. Let's remember that behind every story of privilege, a prison disguised as a palace can hide. And let's remember, above all, those young women who deserved love instead of fear, freedom instead of chains, humanity instead of silence.